Welcome, everyone. I'm Richard Herskowitz, the artistic director of Ashland Independent Film Festival, and welcome to our special TalkBack session celebrating the 30th anniversary of the film Poison. Poison was the feature film debut of producer Christine Vachon and director Todd Haynes, the first of their many collaborations over the past 30 plus years. This year, AIFF is presenting its 6th annual Pride Award to Christine Vachon. And in addition to offering a 30th anniversary screening of Poison, we're also going to be presenting a 20th anniversary screening of her production of Hedwig and the Angry Inch. That's going to be in our live festival in June. So this talkback has been arranged as part of our celebration of Christine Vachon's career. And I'm very grateful that director Todd Haynes has agreed to join us, along with B. Ruby Rich, who will be the moderator of this discussion. Ruby was the recipient of our Pride Award in 2019 and is the person who coined the phrase and the movement New Queer Cinema back in 1992, citing Poison, and another film produced by Christine, Tom Kalin's Swoon, as being exemplary of this emerging movement. So Tom Kalin was our Pride Award recipient last year. Now I'd like to turn the chair over to Ruby, who will be moderating this session. Thank you, Ruby.
Thank you so much, Richard. Hello, Christine. Hello, Todd. Great to have you both here. I just wanted to say that it's kind of a treat. We've been in the trenches on and off with each other. I don't think we've ever been against each other, but let's say with each other through a lot of these moments. And it's kind of a treat to go back to the beginning and think about it from this point of view today. So the two of you, as some people may know, met when you were at Brown and moved separately to New York City after that, and ended up teaming up as you were both working on different projects. You had started assistant producing. Christine, I know you worked on Parting Glances, for instance, one of the key early films, no?
Saying that I was producing or assistant producing is a little bit of a stretch. I would call it production assisting, you know. And I did get to work on Parting Glances as an editing room assistant, which was pretty awesome. But, you know, I can't take any credit for producing any of those movies.
Well, it was a good environment to be a little pollywog in, though, I think. But didn't you grow up as a New York City film brat? You grew up in New York, didn't you?
I grew up in New York, and I grew up on the Upper West Side. I could walk to at least 5 movie theaters, including, you know, the Olympia, you know, where your feet stuck to the floor, the Thalia, where my parents inexplicably kept taking us to Marx Brothers movies. But we started going to the movies by ourselves by the time, you know, we were 9 or 10 years old. And if the movie was rated R, we would wait in front for a Columbia student to walk by and walk us in.
See, great survival tactics from a young age. Todd, when you moved to New York after Brown, was that your first time living in the city?
Oh, wait, Todd,
you're on mute. Hold on. You're on mute. Okay, I'll ask it again. So, Todd, when you moved from Brown down to New York after graduation, was that your first time living in New York City?
Yes, it was my first time living in the city. Yeah, I'm from Los Angeles, and then I had moved to the East Coast for those college years in Providence.
So LA gives you a very different film pedigree, at least in the popular imagination, I would think.
It does, although the sort of era of the revival cinema was in full throttle in Los Angeles as it was in New York and in most big cities across the country. And LA had a remarkable repertory of theaters, the New Art, the Fox Venice. There was even a time in the early the very end of the 70s, where it started to spread the sort of repertory screen programming to theaters even in the San Fernando Valley where my folks lived. So it was really it was an education to be able to see movies on the screen, 2 different double bills a night.
So the two of you end up in New York City, and with a Brown classmate of yours, Barry Ellsworth, you set up this brand new kind of entity called Apparatus Productions and declare that you're going to help produce independent film. You're going to work with filmmakers to give them the skills to make these films. And I know it's going to seem weird to people today, but this was a completely new idea. This was unimaginable. And I was at the New York State Council on the Arts at the time. I was running the film program, and we ended up coming in and giving you a tiny bit of seed money, even though we couldn't quite figure out what it was you thought you were going to do. And this becomes the start of this long collaboration. What was that moment like? Can you both talk a little bit about the late 80s? You found Apparatus, you founded it in 1987, and the next year you put out a Superstar, Todd, and the two of you together released Poison in 1991 at Sundance. That's 87 to 91, this 4-year period, kind of like a presidential term. What's going on in New York then? What's going on with the two of you? And what does the film scene feel like at that time? What's driving you?
Who do you want to go first, Ruby?
You go first.
Well, when I grew up in New York, but I also, I came back. I sort of, re-entered after Brown, and it was a really, sort of the 80s that people sort of mythologize now, but it really did feel like a sort of extraordinary collision of, art and film and music and fashion. There were filmmakers who were starting to make their first films, like Jim Jarmusch and Spike Lee and Betty Gordon, and they were making films that that felt wholly personal, but also were sort of leaning into various narrative and production tropes from Hollywood films. These were not the movies that, when I was growing up, my older sister was an experimental filmmaker, and I would go sometimes and see her short films and programs at places like the Collective for Living Cinema, and, come out of there going like, they were like anti-narrative. They were, essentially
They sure were.
Anti-fun. And suddenly I was seeing these films, I was starting to see these movies from filmmakers who were really saying, I have a story to tell that Hollywood won't tell, but I'm going to use production to tell it. And I feel like, when Todd showed me Superstar for the first time, I did have this epiphany of like, wow, okay, this is what I've been looking for. This is what I've been thinking about. Like, this is a film that is so extraordinarily original, but it's also entertaining and incredibly provocative. So that was it.
Todd, I think that was just a throw to you, I believe.
That was a throw to me. Well, yeah, I would just add that I think Christine's and my own trajectory was sort of coming out of this pretty unique critical theory program at Brown, where we were both starting to make films ourselves. And there are various points through the history of film where there's definitely an interaction between experimental and narrative filmmaking, or underground and Hollywood filmmaking. And one can look at different parts of the 1960s as that being the case. But we definitely were feeling it in our own time and place in the 1980s, where, as Christine said, that sort of refusal of narrative, as Yvonne Rainer famously sort of said, no to spectacle, no to pleasure, no to discovery, no to... All of a sudden, experimental filmmakers were saying, yes, I'm curious about narrative form. I'm curious about genre, right? And I'm curious about ways of looking at the language that comes out of society and giving it a different frame. And I think that's very much what inspired the kind of films that we were interested in, that we were starting to make ourselves, and definitely inspired my film Superstar, and inspired what this project was that Barry Ellsworth had invited Christine and I to take part in,
Right.
which I should just say was a nonprofit organization we started not for the development of our own work, but to sort of serve a community that we thought needed some help in getting their first grants and getting their very first films made that were kind of falling in between different categories.
No, that's great. And it laid the groundwork, I think, for what turns out to be this lifelong collaboration between the two of you. So I'm curious, as you're helping these other people begin to make their films, and also as this sector is evolving so fast. I mean, when you start out, there isn't anything called American independent film, really. You know, when you start out in the 80s, Sundance isn't called Sundance. I mean, all of this begins to evolve in the late 80s, early 90s. And I wondered, how does your thinking start to evolve as you're working on apparatus? You're working with people like Susan Laurie Parks and other young talents coming up, and you begin to envision that there's actually a way to make features, not just these short films, but actually maybe you can put these pieces together, which is in a sense what Poison does as a tripart kind of film in different styles. How is your thinking evolving then? What is important to you in this moment as you begin to approach filmmaking? You're living in New York. It's very much still the era of AIDS, of people on the front lines organizing, people in front, back, and center falling ill or dying. What is driving the two of you to say, let's do this ourselves? We're helping these other people. We've made these shorter pieces. Let's go for it. Or maybe that's not what you said. What was the evolution of Poison back in the beginning when it's just evolving?
Well, I'll start because I'm sure we have slightly different recollections, and Todd's will probably be more accurate. But you know, I guess, you know, we had started apparatus. We were, you know, working with these, you know, very, you know, young filmmakers. I mean, I don't think they were much younger than we were. But one of the things that came out of that was that, you know, we were working on the actual, you know, construction of these films, the production of these films, really side by side, and that's really when Todd and I became friends. I mean, you know, we didn't really know each other very well at Brand. And as I said, I saw Superstar, and I think I pivoted to, it already seemed like apparatus was going to come to a natural conclusion. And Todd started talking about his next project, which was Poison, these 3 different stories. Now, Todd, this is what I remember, and I may be wrong. I remember that you originally started talking about Poison as being an hour long. Like you were sort of like, I did a 45-minute piece. I feel like I can go to an hour. And I was starting to get a sense of the marketplace, or, you know, for what it's worth. I was starting to get, I mean, and I say this like a whisper of a sense, because it's not like I knew anything, but I was starting to get a sense of like festivals and movies selling and feature films. And I just thought, like, this should be, if this is 90 minutes, then it's like a whole different place. We're in a whole different ballgame. And, you know, this was also, you know, you have to understand at this point, you know, Superstar became almost too successful because it started to get the attention of, you know, the people who would eventually prevent Todd from being able to show the movie. But it also brought Todd to the attention of a lot of like grant giving organizations, et cetera, et cetera. So we were sort of at a really good moment.
Can I jump in here, Christine? Because just for people who don't know Superstar, I should just say the subtitle is the Karen Carpenter story, and it was the story of Karen Carpenter's life and eventual death shown through Barbie dolls, and it had a massive underground success, fan base, obsessed excessive followers, and you're right, attracted all the kinds of right and wrong attention.
Yeah, following up on everything Christine said, which I do sort of remember this conversation about this sort of scope that Poison might become. But I think it was, for me, it was definitely because of Superstar, because I found the audience reaction to Superstar so encouraging that audiences that wouldn't necessarily have encountered that film,
Right.
largely because of the fact that it was circulating more broadly than we had expected, could handle a film that was taking on the Star Story genre with various quotation marks and looking at different kinds of storytelling through different kinds of contrasting frames and points of reference. Because there were these sort of pseudo-documentary passages in Poison. There was the narrative passage with the dolls. And I found it encouraging in terms of a sort of sophistication about the level of viewership, that people wanted to be sort of challenged and were as enthusiastic about some of the ideas that Christine and I shared, as we were. And that was a surprise to me. So I felt like, let's take that a little bit further in a larger format project. But of course, behind all of this was AIDS.
Right.
And a climate, especially in New York City. And Christine and I very quickly got involved in ACT UP and activism around HIV and AIDS. And we're just sort of, like all of us, taking in the magnitude of this health crisis and the patent denial of its importance on the part of government and so forth. And I think it started to also motivate a lot of queer filmmakers, clearly, in an urgency to respond to the predicaments that we were facing. And so Poison, in many ways, was driven by all of these things, both narrative opportunities and sort of optimism, but also a real urgent cultural and social situation that we were all confronting and that I wanted to engage with. And that in my way, I was trying to sort of apply Jean Genet to what was happening. Jean Genet had only passed away in 1986.
Right.
And I felt like, what would Genet have to say about this moment that we were in, where gay people were sort of accepting a lot of the blame and culpability that was being foisted upon that community and was in a sort of retrenchment, And I felt like, let's look at Genet and see if that could provide some inspiration.
Yeah, that's great. I know Genet died just in this moment that being gay was decriminalized in France. It was like he couldn't take it being official, right? It's like he was committed to its criminality.
Exactly.
No, just kidding.
Well, no,
but that is,
he actually was committed to its criminality.
You wrote so eloquently about film for The Guardian, Christine, about a little over 4 years ago when Carol was coming out and when Trump had been elected, and you talked about, in a way, the burden of representation, but the question of what does film have to offer? And was that true then at the time of Poison too? Was that how you were thinking then as well?
I think, I mean, yes. And I do want to go back to something that, Todd said about, the sense of urgency that, the AIDS crisis gave us as filmmakers of just like, we have to tell our stories now because, who knows if we'll ever get another chance. And so there was a real sense of like, just do it and don't ask for permission, etc. But I got, Poison, definitely, I think, it because it was attacked. Well, let me go back for a second. It was attacked by the American Family Association because it had received some federal grants. And suddenly Todd and I found ourselves on, talk shows with people like Ralph Reed and
Army.
it was crazy.
With people describing scenes that weren't even in the film, as I recall.
Describing things that weren't even in the film, and people who mostly hadn't seen the film. You know, although my favorite headline was, you know, some conservative woman from the American Family Association who said the film was so disgusting she wanted to wash in bleach afterwards.
It made me want to bathe in Clorox.
Yes.
This was after a senatorial screening they had in DC.
That I think was
senators. That was yeah, exactly. And somebody called me, I'll never have a better description, the Fellini of fellatio.
It sounds like a John Waters line.
Right?
Oh God. Well, at least you were Fellini.
Right?
What was starting to sort of bubble up at that point, by the time Poison came out, was this whole notion of positive representation, and how there was a whole sort of, you know, segment, I suppose, or whatever you want to call it, of the LGBTQ community that became very fixated on, we need to show them, I assume straight people, that we're not demons. So if you make a movie that you know, doesn't sort of reinforce that we're just like everybody else, you're part of the problem. And
That's right.
obviously I had no interest in making a movie like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think Todd did either. And so, you know, our work was often, you know, criticized for that.
Yeah. Yeah, you weren't working for your own ad agency. You were trying to do something else.
But it's
Todd?
also important to, just for people who may not know about this sort of chapter in the culture wars, that Poison fell into a pattern where a lot of publicly funded art had been the focus of a lot of conservative uprising and outcry and protest. Mapplethorpe's exhibition in Cincinnati was one of the instigating events. The NEA4 were 4 performance artists whose grants were rescinded. And it almost always, although they never really admitted as much, was the result of queer representation, right?
That's right.
And Poison became the first of these various publicly funded works that was a film, and that had the potential of being seen at the same time in many more venues across the country than any performance artist or exhibition of an artist's work could be. And so it raised the stakes a little bit about the fever around the whole issue of public funding for the arts and the role the government played and what kind of content was being sanctioned, right? And, you know, now people will probably think, wow, there was actually public funding for the arts.
I know.
Argument that we were all waging and we felt extremely committed to defending. In principle, it was really indicative of a different kind of discussion that we are still feeling today about controlling representation, right? And controlling what kinds of stories could be told, whether they're being funded by the government or whether they're being funded by the marketplace.
That's right. And the Republicans really seized on the culture wars as a war they could win. And they've never really let it go.
Yeah.
But this was the beginning of it. This was the beginning of this whole strategy. I want to go back to Poison, too, because it's such a distinctive film. And it's the one we're here talking about. But I think that I noticed that when there was a retrospective of the apparatus films, and I was lucky enough to be in New York when that happened, there was an article about them called The Politics of Style. And I kind of want to bring that phrase back up because I think that, you know, for all that you were in this moment of experimental filmmaking, you have always been such a stylist, Todd, and you have always worked with filmmakers with such distinctive styles, Christine, and your work together has been so marked by this collaboration. I wonder if you talk a bit about style and about how you think of film then and now. Has it changed? You're not making films like Poison anymore, but you're certainly making films as involved with their moments. How do you think about this now? How do you think about your own stylistic evolution?
I feel like Todd is better poised to really answer that, because I feel like for me it's less about style than it is about vision and about working with directors who have obviously extraordinary visions, but also visions that I can understand and that I always say, like, the most important thing to me about a director is that they can articulate their vision effectively, because then I know if they can to me, they can to everybody, to that, even a small film like Poison had a lot of people, and being able to communicate that vision effectively is how I know that we're going to get something pretty close to what, starts in a director's head and get that on the screen. So that's really, I work with a lot of directors with a lot of different kinds of styles in every way, shape, or form, who come onto a set and behave very differently from each other. But as long as I have a sense that they can, effectively render that vision and I'm behind it, then I'm good.
Cool. Todd?
Well,
Say something from your point of view?
I guess when Christine says style, it sounds more like how the directors are their personal style, which is a huge part of directing and how you communicate with other people around you. But I assume you were talking about, Poison is basically an experiment in how to tell the same story from three different narrative perspectives, with three different narrative genres or styles, basically describing the story of an outsider and someone who's been stigmatized by their society. And for me, it was very much about contrasting how style and form determine how we think about how subjects are depicted. And I was very much aware of the way people were being depicted, people with AIDS were being depicted in the mass media at this time and objectified. And that there was almost a sort of sensationalism, a panic that one might find in the horror genre, right? And that's why one of the stories in Poison adopts the B-style horror genre as the way that particular story is telling.
Yeah. The central section is a kind of Jekyll and Hyde horror movie that I think resonates weirdly today, I would suspect.
Yeah, well, with our epidemic and sense of illness is a continued language, which was also a theme in my next film after Poison, Safe. But that narrative style was contrasted by one that was much more inspired by Genet himself, Genet's work, the sort of prison love story in the film that was adapted from Thief's Journal and Miracle of the Rose and Funeral Rites. And that was contrasted in turn by a kind of tabloid television account of a little missing boy. And the way he sort of undermined the mores of his little community. But style, to me, carries with it like all of the sort of cultural language that orients us about our attitudes, about who the subjects are in these stories. And so that has become absolutely something that has been a through line, I think, in my films, whether it's Far From Heaven, which would then adopt and look into the melodrama and traditions of directors who were trying to sort of find the inherent political points of view that the melodrama reveals about very rigid social systems, right? Which Fassbinder loved in the work of Douglas Sirk, and that I loved the work of both of those directors. And that was something I was exploring in that film. But I sort of feel like those issues have continued to inform films that were not necessarily as aggressively experimental as Poison was, but still continued to be a sort of point of interest in my films.
Well, it's interesting to me that both of you, I mean, you've had such a long working relationship, and you both have such strong reputations on your own and are both very passionate individualists, and yet you're both so committed to collaboration, not just with each other, but your work with Ed Lackman and Christine, your company with Pam Koffler, Killer Films. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about these relationships and how filmmaking doesn't just come out of nowhere. It doesn't just come out of one person's brain, but how you've been able successfully to keep this freshness and just this kind of genius for making these films across more than 3 decades.
I think that what I've certainly learned in my work with Todd and in my work with Pam Koffler is, there is I'm kind of relentlessly loyal. I think Todd is too, and we've had, it hasn't always been like a bed of roses. We've had disagreements or difficult times, but I think whenever we had them, we always knew that they'd get resolved. So it gave us sort of more room to disagree. And same with Pam. like we can disagree with each other because I know she's not gonna, say that's it and walk out. So I can be really honest. I feel very safe. And I feel like, with every movie that I'm lucky enough to get to do with Todd, I always discover something new. Sometimes it's in the actual storytelling. Sometimes it's in how it's put together. I mean, it usually does have to do with the craft. And part of that is also seeing Todd discover new things about his craft as well. And it's endlessly inspiring.
Todd?
How do I follow that? Well, no, look, we're blessed with a relationship and friendship and a understanding, I think, of each other that has survived for so many years in all the ways that Christine describes, because of a basis of trust and loyalty that's there, and an understanding that films are hard things to major endeavors that test you in so many different ways. And they also break up into phases that are very different, in their temperament and in their energy and expenditure. And so we've seen each other perform in so many of these. Each film is different, and yet the internal chapters that they're made up of have similarities, of course. But I wouldn't have the career I have without this extraordinary relationship with Christine. It's really true, not just at a practical level of like her refusing to take no for an answer when we tried to get financing on difficult films to find the money for, but I think in just in a basic psychic gestalt that we share about each other, from where we came from, and the way we look at the world, which continues to sort of support basic values I think we've always had as people. But that does extend. I have fantastic creative relationships with partners, and this is a collaborative medium. And it's about communication, and it's about developing those relationships and really being able to trust that those relationships are going to deliver in different circumstances and under different scenarios and with different sort of rules that we apply with regard to each film that we make.
Right, but I also think it's because you have the confidence in what you do, in your ability as a filmmaker, that makes you a wonderful collaborator, because it doesn't threaten you. I mean, your response, I guess the one thing is directors don't get to see other directors direct.
Yeah, you do.
I do. And I get to see other producers produce. I have to do it with them.
Yeah.
And I feel, But a lot of directors don't relish the level of collaboration that you do. And I think it's because ultimately you have your confidence and your assurance is strong enough that you're willing to let all those points of view in, and it just makes your work so much, even stronger.
Well, I love the work that you two have done together. And I love Ashland Film Festival for creating this moment, And I don't want to get off the line, so to speak, without bringing things up to date just for a second, because aren't you guys working on another film that's about to come out? What's going on with this documentary? Something about Velvet Underground? What is this?
Yeah, we are. We'll hopefully be coming to a festival, maybe near you, maybe not near you.
Mhm.
And look, Velvet Underground's a good example. It just, I kind of went into it. Documentaries are not what either of us is known for. And it was sort of a wonderful challenge, a wonderful, way. I think, often when directors like Todd do these kinds of music documentaries, there's a feeling of like, well, they're just putting their name on it, because it's not, they're narrative directors. It's not really what they do, but that wasn't the case here. And it was really extraordinary to see this unfold. I think, I think the movie's amazing, and I can't wait for the world to see it.
Yay. Todd, what led you to this?
Well,
Years after Velvet Goldmine.
Velvet Goldmine, whatever. If the Velvet's in the title, I'm in. Well, look, we the David Blackman at Universal Music Group, who controls the music for the Velvet Underground and half of all recorded music in the world, has been trying to create films and film and TV around their amazing catalog of music, and came to Christine, I think, with a proposition when I think it had to do with when Laurie Anderson was handing over Lou Reed's estate finally, and was opening up the idea of making materials available, right? And I think my name came up from her initially, and that was passed on through Christine to me, and I was like, oh yeah, I would relish doing a documentary, which I've never done before, about the Velvet Underground. Now, what's challenging about the Velvet Underground is they're a band who's so well known, of course, and so influential, but who have virtually no traditional kinds of footage or material of them performing in concerts or on stage the way most famous bands of their mantle do. What they do have, though, is the most exquisitely beautiful films by Andy Warhol. And the entire culture of the avant-garde that was thriving in New York City in the mid-60s as a kind of background and fuel to what they ultimately were doing musically and on stage. So this became sort of my creative sort of, plan, was to really use those films and those images as a way to tell the story visually, and to ideally let you hear that music in its context in a way that you would feel like you were hearing it for the first time, or hearing it as if it was happening then. So it was an opportunity, especially during COVID, to dig in with my two editors, and get into the actual archival material and avant-garde films and underground films that really make up the visual language of this doc. So it's, in that way, it's been such an education. And
that's great. I have to say, I saw Nico and the Velvet Underground perform with a 2-screen version of Chelsea Girls in Boston in 1967 at midnight at the Museum of Contemporary Art. And it was so long ago that I was on a date with a boy, and a Harvard student, and he fell asleep about a minute after it started, and woke up with the applause at the end and said it was brilliant. And that is my humble experience, but it's something I never forgot. So I look forward to it especially.
That's amazing.
And I love to hear that this is what's coming out from you two next, because it almost makes a full circle back to Poison and this kind of renegade, almost unimaginable fusing of forms, and probably challenge to the audience in all the best ways. So I just want to thank you both for this conversation, and it's really been fun, and I look forward to all the next.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruby, so much.
Thanks, Christine. Thanks, Todd.